Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey, narrated by Clive Chafer. Introduction. Future historians may well look upon the years 1978 to 80 as a revolutionary turning point in the world's social and economic history. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took the first momentous steps towards the liberalization of a communist-ruled economy in a country that accounted for a fifth of the world's population. The path that Deng defined was to transform China in 2 decades from a closed backwater to an open center of capitalist dynamism with sustained growth rates unparalleled in human history. On the other side of the Pacific, and in quite different circumstances, a relatively obscure but now renowned figure named Paul Volcker took command at the U.S. Federal Reserve in July 1979, and within a few months dramatically changed monetary policy. The Fed thereafter took the lead in the fight against inflation, no matter what its consequences, particularly as concerned unemployment. Across the Atlantic, Margaret Thatcher had already been elected Prime Minister of Britain in May 1979 with a mandate to curb trade union power and put an end to the miserable inflationary stagnation that had enveloped the country for the preceding decade. Then in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, and armed with geniality and personal charisma, set the U.S. on course to revitalize its economy by supporting Volcker's moves at the Fed, and adding his own particular blend of policies to curb the power of labor, deregulate industry, agriculture, and resource extraction, and liberate the powers of finance both internally and on the world stage. From these several epicenters, revolutionary impulses seemingly spread and reverberated to remake the world around us in a totally different image. Transformations of this scope and depth do not occur by accident, so it is pertinent to inquire by what means and paths the new economic configuration, often subsumed under the term globalization, was plucked from the entrails of the old. Volcker, Reagan, Thatcher, and Deng Xiaoping all took minority arguments that had long been in circulation and made them majoritarian, though in no case without a protracted struggle. Reagan brought to life the minority tradition that stretched back within the Republican Party to Barry Goldwater in the early 1960s. Deng saw the rising tide of wealth and influence in Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea, and sought to mobilize market socialism instead of central planning to protect and advance the interests of the Chinese state. Volcker and Thatcher both plucked from the shadows of relative obscurity a particular doctrine that went under the name of Neoliberalism, and transformed it into the central guiding principle of economic thought and management. And it is with this doctrine, its origins, rise, and implications, that I am here primarily concerned. Neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up those military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. Furthermore, if markets do not exist, in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, or environmental pollution, then they must be created, by state action if necessary. But beyond these tasks, the state should not venture. State interventions in markets once created must be kept to a bare minimum, because, according to the theory, the state cannot possibly possess enough information to second-guess market signals, prices, and because powerful interest groups will inevitably distort and bias state interventions, particularly in democracies, for their own benefit. There has everywhere been an emphatic turn towards neoliberalism in political economic practices and thinking since the 1970s. Deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common. Almost all states, from those newly minted after the collapse of the Soviet Union to old-style social democracies and welfare states such as New Zealand and Sweden, have embraced, sometimes voluntarily and in other instances in response to coercive pressures, some version of neoliberal theory and adjusted at least some policies and practices accordingly. Post-apartheid South Africa quickly embraced neoliberalism, and even contemporary China, as we shall see, appears to be headed in this direction. Furthermore, the advocates of the neoliberal way now occupy positions of considerable influence in education, the universities and many think tanks, in the media, in corporate boardrooms and financial institutions, in key state institutions, treasury departments, the central banks, and also in those international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, WTO, that regulate global finance and trade. Neoliberalism has in short become hegemonic as a mode of discourse. It has pervasive effects on ways of thought, to the point where it has become incorporated into the common sense way many of us interpret, live in, and understand the world. The process of neoliberalization has, however, entailed much creative destruction, not only of prior institutional frameworks and powers, even challenging traditional forms of state sovereignty, but also of divisions of labor, social relations, welfare provisions, technological mixes, ways of life and thought, reproductive activities, attachments to the land, and habits of the heart. Insofar as neoliberalism values market exchange as an ethic in itself, capable of acting as a guide to all human action and substituting for all previously held ethical beliefs, it emphasizes the significance of contractual relations in the marketplace. It holds that the social good will be maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of market transactions, and it seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. This requires technologies of information creation and capacities to accumulate, store, transfer, analyze, and use massive databases to guide decisions in the global marketplace. Hence neoliberalism's intense interest in and pursuit of information technologies, leading some to proclaim the emergence of a new kind of information society. These technologies have compressed the rising density of market transactions in both space and time. They have produced a particularly intensive burst of what I have elsewhere called time-space compression. The greater the geographical range, hence the emphasis on globalization, and the shorter the term of market contracts, the better. This latter preference parallels Lyotard's famous description of the postmodern condition as one where the temporary contract supplants permanent institutions in the professional, emotional, sexual, cultural, family and international domains, as well as in political affairs. The cultural consequences of the dominance of such a market ethic are legion, as I earlier showed in The Condition of Postmodernity. While many general accounts of global transformations and their effects are now available, what is generally missing, and this is the gap this book aims to fill, is the political-economic story of where neoliberalization came from and how it proliferated so comprehensively on the world stage. Critical engagement with that story suggests, furthermore, a framework for identifying and constructing alternative political and economic arrangements. I have benefited in recent times from conversations with Gérard Duménil, Sam Gindin, and Leo Panitch. I have more long-standing debts to Masao Miyoshi, Giovanni Arrighi, Patrick Bond, Cindy Katz, Neil Smith, Bertel Ollmann, Maria Kaika, and Eric Svenchedau. A conference on neoliberalism sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin in November 2001 first sparked my interest in this topic. I thank the provost at the CUNY Graduate Center, Bill Kelly, and my colleagues and students primarily but not exclusively in the anthropology program for their interest and support. I absolve everyone, of course, from any responsibility for the results. 1. Freedom's just another word. For any way of thought to become dominant, a conceptual apparatus has to be advanced that appeals to our intuitions and instincts, to our values and our desires, as well as to the possibilities inherent in the social world we inhabit. If successful, this conceptual apparatus becomes so embedded in common sense as to be taken for granted and not open to question. The founding figures of neoliberal thought took political ideals of human dignity and individual freedom as fundamental, as the central values of civilization. In so doing, they chose wisely, for these are indeed compelling and seductive ideals. These values, they held, were threatened not only by fascism, dictatorships and communism, but by all forms of state intervention that substituted collective judgments for those of individuals free to choose. Concepts of dignity and individual freedom are powerful and appealing in their own right. Such ideals empowered the dissident movements in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union before the end of the Cold War, as well as the students in Tiananmen Square. The student movements that swept the world in 1968, from Paris and Chicago to Bangkok and Mexico City, were in part animated by the quest for greater freedoms of speech and of personal choice. More generally, these ideals appeal to anyone who values the ability to make decisions for themselves. The idea of freedom, long embedded in the U.S. tradition, has played a conspicuous role in the U.S. in recent years. 9/11 was immediately interpreted by many as an attack on it. "A peaceful world of growing freedom," wrote President Bush on the first anniversary of that awful day, "serves American long-term interests, reflects enduring American ideals, and unites America's allies. Humanity," he concluded, "holds in its hands the opportunity to offer freedom's triumph over all its age-old foes, and the United States welcomes its responsibilities to lead in this great mission." This language was incorporated into the U.S. National Defense Strategy document issued shortly thereafter. "Freedom is the Almighty's gift to every man and woman in this world," he later said, adding that, as the greatest power on earth, we have an obligation to help the spread of freedom. When all of the other reasons for engaging in a preemptive war against Iraq were proven wanting, the President appealed to the idea that the freedom conferred on Iraq was in and of itself an adequate justification for the war. The Iraqis were free, and that was all that really mattered. But what sort of freedom is envisaged here, since, as the cultural critic Matthew Arnold long ago thoughtfully observed, freedom is a very good horse to ride, but to ride somewhere. To what destination, then, are the Iraqi people expected to ride the horse of freedom donated to them by force of arms? The Bush administration's answer to this question was spelled out on the 19th of September 2003, when Paul Bremer, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, promulgated 4 orders that included the full privatization of public enterprises, full ownership rights by foreign firms of Iraqi businesses, full repatriation of foreign profits, the opening of Iraq's banks to foreign control, national treatment for foreign companies, and the elimination of nearly all trade barriers. The orders were to apply to all areas of the economy, including public services, the media, manufacturing, services, transportation, finance, and construction. Only oil was exempt, presumably because of its special status as revenue producer to pay for the war and its geopolitical significance. The labor market, on the other hand, was to be strictly regulated. Strikes were effectively forbidden in key sectors and the right to unionize restricted. A highly regressive flat tax, an ambitious tax reform plan long advocated for implementation by conservatives in the US, was also imposed. These orders were, some argued, in violation of the Geneva and Hague Conventions, since an occupying power is mandated to guard the assets of an occupied country and not sell them off. Some Iraqis resisted the imposition of what the London Economist called a capitalist dream regime upon Iraq. A member of the US-appointed Coalition Provisional Authority forcefully criticized the imposition of free market fundamentalism, calling it a flawed logic that ignores history. Though Bremer's rules may have been illegal when imposed by an occupying power, they would become legal if confirmed by a sovereign government. The interim government, appointed by the US, that took over at the end of June 2004, was declared sovereign, but it only had the power to confirm existing laws. Before the handover, Bremer multiplied the number of laws to specify free market and free trade rules in minute detail on detailed matters such as copyright laws and intellectual property rights, expressing the hope that these institutional arrangements would take on a life and momentum of their own, such that they would prove very difficult to reverse. According to neoliberal theory, the sorts of measures that Bremer outlined were both necessary and sufficient for the creation of wealth, and therefore for the improved well-being of the population at large. The assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by freedom of the market and of trade is a cardinal feature of neoliberal thinking, and it has long dominated the US stance towards the rest of the world. What the US evidently sought to impose by main force on Iraq was a state apparatus whose fundamental mission was to facilitate conditions for profitable capital accumulation on the part of both domestic and foreign capital. I call this kind of state apparatus a neoliberal state. The freedoms it embodies reflect the interests of private property owners, businesses, multinational corporations, and financial capital. Bremer invited the Iraqis, in short, to ride their horse of freedom straight into the neoliberal corral. The first experiment with neoliberal state formation, it is worth recalling, occurred in Chile after Pinochet's coup on the little September 11th of 1973, almost 30 years to the day before Bremer's announcement of the regime to be installed in Iraq. The coup against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende was promoted by domestic business elites threatened by Allende's drive towards socialism. It was backed by U.S. corporations, the CIA, and U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. It violently repressed all the social movements and political organizations of the left and dismantled all forms of popular organization, such as the community health centers in poorer neighborhoods. The labor market was freed from regulatory or institutional restraints, trade union power, for example. But how was the stalled economy to be revived? The policies of import substitution, fostering national industries by subsidies or tariff protections that had dominated Latin American attempts at economic development, had fallen into disrepute, particularly in Chile, where they had never worked that well. With the whole world in economic recession, a new approach was called for. A group of economists known as the Chicago Boys, because of their attachment to the neoliberal theories of Milton Friedman, then teaching at the University of Chicago, was summoned to help reconstruct the Chilean economy. The story of how they were chosen is an interesting one. The US had funded training of Chilean economists at the University of Chicago since the 1950s, as part of a Cold War program to counteract left-wing tendencies in Latin America. Chicago-trained economists came to dominate at the private Catholic University in Santiago. During the early 1970s, business elites organized their opposition to Allende through a group called the Monday Club and developed a working relationship with these economists, funding their work through research institutes. After General Gustavo Lee, Pinochet's rival for power and a Keynesian, was sidelined in 1975, Pinochet brought these economists into the government, where their first job was to negotiate loans with the International Monetary Fund. Working alongside the IMF, they restructured the economy according to their theories. They reversed the nationalizations and privatized public assets, opened up natural resources, fisheries, timber, etc., to private and unregulated exploitation, in many cases riding roughshod over the claims of indigenous inhabitants, privatized social security, and facilitated foreign direct investment and freer trade. The right of foreign companies to repatriate profits from their Chilean operations was guaranteed. Export-led growth was favored over import substitution. The only sector reserved for the state was the key resource of copper, rather like oil in Iraq. This proved crucial to the budgetary viability of the state, since copper revenues flowed exclusively into its coffers. The immediate revival of the Chilean economy in terms of growth rates, capital accumulation, and high rates of return on foreign investments was short-lived. It all went sour in the Latin American debt crisis of 1982. The result was a much more pragmatic and less ideologically driven application of neoliberal policies in the years that followed. All of this, including the pragmatism, provided helpful evidence to support the subsequent turn to neoliberalism in both Britain under Thatcher and the US under Reagan in the 1980s. Not for the first time, a brutal experiment carried out in the periphery became a model for the formulation of policies in the center, much as experimentation with the flat tax in Iraq has been proposed under Bremer's decrees. The fact that two such obviously similar restructurings of the state apparatus occurred at such different times in quite different parts of the world under the coercive influence of the United States suggests that the grim reach of U.S. imperial power might lie behind the rapid proliferation of neoliberal state forms throughout the world from the mid-1970s onwards. While this has undoubtedly occurred over the last 30 years, it by no means constitutes the whole story, as the domestic component of the neoliberal turn in Chile shows. It was not the US, furthermore, that forced Margaret Thatcher to take the pioneering neoliberal path she took in 1979. Nor was it the US that forced China in 1978 to set out on a path of liberalization. The partial moves towards neoliberalization in India in the 1980s and Sweden in the early 1990s cannot easily be attributed to the imperial reach of US power. The uneven geographical development of neoliberalism on the world stage has evidently been a very complex process entailing multiple determinations and not a little chaos and confusion. Why, then, did the neoliberal turn occur, and what were the forces that made it so hegemonic within global capitalism? Why the neoliberal turn? The restructuring of state forms and of international relations after the Second World War was designed to prevent a return to the catastrophic conditions that had so threatened the capitalist order in the great slump of the 1930s. It was also supposed to prevent the re-emergence of interstate geopolitical rivalries that had led to the war. To ensure domestic peace and tranquility, some sort of class compromise between capital and labor had to be constructed. The thinking at the time is perhaps best represented by an influential text by two eminent social scientists, Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom, published in 1953. Both capitalism and communism in their raw forms had failed, they argued. The only way ahead was to construct the right blend of state, market, and democratic institutions to guarantee peace, inclusion, well-being, and stability. Internationally, a new world order was constructed through the Bretton Woods agreements, and various institutions, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, were set up to help stabilize international relations. Free trade in goods was encouraged under a system of fixed exchange rates, anchored by the US dollar's convertibility into gold at a fixed price. Fixed exchange rates were incompatible with free flows of capital that had to be controlled, but the US had to allow the free flow of the dollar beyond its borders if the dollar was to function as the global reserve currency. This system existed under the umbrella protection of US military power. Only the Soviet Union and the Cold War placed limits on its global reach. A variety of social democratic, Christian democratic, and dirigiste states emerged in Europe after the Second World War. The US itself turned towards a liberal democratic state form, and Japan, under the close supervision of the US, built a nominally democratic, but in practice highly bureaucratic state apparatus, empowered to oversee the reconstruction of that country. What all of these various state forms had in common was an acceptance that the state should focus on full employment, economic growth, and the welfare of its citizens, and that state power should be freely deployed, alongside of, or if necessary intervening in, or even substituting for market processes to achieve these ends. Fiscal and monetary policies, usually dubbed Keynesian, were widely deployed to dampen business cycles and to ensure reasonably full employment. A class compromise between capital and labor was generally advocated as the key guarantor of domestic peace and tranquility. States actively intervened in industrial policy and moved to set standards for the social wage by constructing a variety of welfare systems, healthcare, education, and the like. This form of political economic organization is now usually referred to as embedded liberalism, to signal how market processes and entrepreneurial and corporate activities were surrounded by a web of social and political constraints and a regulatory environment that sometimes restrained, but in other instances led the way in economic and industrial strategy. State-led planning and, in some instances, state ownership of key sectors, coal, steel, automobiles, were not uncommon, for example in Britain, France, and Italy. The neoliberal project is to disembed capital from these constraints. Embedded liberalism delivered high rates of economic growth in the advanced capitalist countries during the 1950s and 1960s. In part, this depended on the largesse of the US in being prepared to run deficits with the rest of the world and to absorb any excess product within its borders. This system conferred benefits such as expanding export markets, most obviously for Japan, but also unevenly across South America and to some other countries of Southeast Asia. But attempts to export development to much of the rest of the world largely stalled. For much of the Third World, particularly Africa, embedded liberalism remained a pipe dream. The subsequent drive towards neoliberalization after 1980 entailed little material change in their impoverished condition. In the advanced capitalist countries, redistributive politics, including some degree of political integration of working-class trade union power and support for collective bargaining, controls over the free mobility of capital, some degree of financial repression through capital controls in particular, expanded public expenditures and welfare state building, active state interventions in the economy, and some degree of planning of development went hand in hand with relatively high rates of growth. The business cycle was successfully controlled through the application of Keynesian fiscal and monetary policies. A social and moral economy, sometimes supported by a strong sense of national identity, was fostered through the activities of an interventionist state. The state in effect became a force field that internalized class relations. Working-class institutions such as labor unions and political parties of the left had a very real influence within the state apparatus. By the end of the 1960s, embedded liberalism began to break down, both internationally and within domestic economies. Signs of a serious crisis of capital accumulation were everywhere apparent. Unemployment and inflation were both surging everywhere, ushering in a global phase of stagflation that lasted throughout much of the 1970s. Fiscal crises of various states, Britain, for example, had to be bailed out by the IMF in 1975-6, resulted as tax revenues plunged and social expenditures soared. Keynesian policies were no longer working. Even before the Arab-Israeli War and the OPEC oil embargo of 1973, the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates backed by gold reserves had fallen into disarray. The porosity of state boundaries with respect to capital flows put stress on the system of fixed exchange rates. US dollars had flooded the world and escaped US controls by being deposited in European banks. Fixed exchange rates were therefore abandoned in 1971. Gold could no longer function as the metallic base of international money. Exchange rates were allowed to float, and attempts to control the float were soon abandoned. The embedded liberalism that had delivered high rates of growth to at least the advanced capitalist countries after 1945 was clearly exhausted and was no longer working. Some alternative was called for if the crisis was to be overcome. One answer was to deepen state control and regulation of the economy through corporatist strategies, including, if necessary, curbing the aspirations of labor and popular movements through austerity measures, incomes policies, and even wage and price controls. This answer was advanced by socialist and communist parties in Europe, with hopes pinned on innovative experiments in governance in places such as communist-controlled Red Bologna in Italy, on the revolutionary transformation of Portugal in the wake of the collapse of fascism, on the turn towards a more open market socialism and ideas of Euro-communism, particularly in Italy under the leadership of Berlinguer and in Spain under the influence of Carrillo, or on the expansion of the strong social democratic welfare state tradition in Scandinavia. The left assembled considerable popular power behind such programs, coming close to power in Italy and actually acquiring state power in Portugal, France, Spain and Britain, while retaining power in Scandinavia. Even in the United States, a Congress controlled by the Democratic Party legislated a huge wave of regulatory reform in the early 1970s, signed into law by Richard Nixon, a Republican president, who in the process even went so far as to remark that "we are all Keynesians now," governing everything from environmental protection to occupational safety and health, civil rights, and consumer protection. But the left failed to go much beyond traditional social democratic and corporatist solutions, and these had by the mid-1970s proven inconsistent with the requirements of capital accumulation. The effect was to polarize debate between those ranged behind social democracy and central planning on the one hand, who, when in power, as in the case of the British Labour Party, often ended up trying to curb, usually for pragmatic reasons, the aspirations of their own constituencies, and the interests of all those concerned with liberating corporate and business power and re-establishing market freedoms on the other. By the mid-1970s, the interests of the latter group came to the fore. But how were the conditions for the resumption of active capital accumulation to be restored? How and why neoliberalism emerged victorious as the single answer to this question is the crux of the problem we have to solve. In retrospect, it may seem as if the answer was both inevitable and obvious. But at the time, I think it is fair to say, no one really knew or understood with any certainty what kind of answer would work and how. The capitalist world stumbled towards neoliberalization as the answer through a series of gyrations and chaotic experiments that really only converged as a new orthodoxy with the articulation of what became known as the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. By then, both Clinton and Blair could easily have reversed Nixon's earlier statement and simply said, "We are all neoliberals now." The uneven geographical development of neoliberalism, its frequently partial and lopsided application from one state and social formation to another, testifies to the tentativeness of neoliberal solutions and the complex ways in which political forces, historical traditions, and existing institutional arrangements all shaped why and how the process of neoliberalization actually occurred. There is, however, one element within this transition that deserves specific attention. The crisis of capital accumulation in the 1970s affected everyone through the combination of rising unemployment and accelerating inflation. Discontent was widespread, and the conjoining of labor and urban social movements throughout much of the advanced capitalist world appeared to point towards the emergence of a socialist alternative to the social compromise between capital and labor that had grounded capital accumulation so successfully in the post-war period. Communist and socialist parties were gaining ground, if not taking power, across much of Europe, and even in the United States popular forces were agitating for widespread reforms and state interventions. There was in this a clear political threat to economic elites and ruling classes everywhere, both in the advanced capitalist countries, such as Italy, France, Spain and Portugal, and in many developing countries, such as Chile, Mexico and Argentina. In Sweden, for example, what was known as the Rehn-Meidner Plan literally offered to gradually buy out the owners' share in their own businesses and turn the country into a worker/share-owner democracy. But beyond this, the economic threat to the position of ruling elites and classes was now becoming palpable. One condition of the post-war settlement in almost all countries was that the economic power of the upper classes be restrained and that labor be accorded a much larger share of the economic pie. In the US, for example, the share of the national income taken by the top 1% of income earners fell from a pre-war high of 16% to less than 8% by the end of the Second World War, and stayed close to that level for nearly 3 decades. While growth was strong, this restraint seemed not to matter. To have a stable share of an increasing pie is one thing. But when growth collapsed in the 1970s, when real interest rates went negative and paltry dividends and profits were the norm, then upper classes everywhere felt threatened. In the US, the control of wealth, as opposed to income, by the top 1% of the population had remained fairly stable throughout the 20th century. But in the 1970s, it plunged precipitously as asset values, stocks, property, savings collapsed. The upper classes had to move decisively if they were to protect themselves from political and economic annihilation. The coup in Chile and the military takeover in Argentina, promoted internally by the upper classes with US support, provided one kind of solution. The subsequent Chilean experiment with neoliberalism demonstrated that the benefits of revived capital accumulation were highly skewed under forced privatization. The country and its ruling elites, along with foreign investors, did extremely well in the early stages. Redistributive effects and increasing social inequality have in fact been such a persistent feature of neoliberalization as to be regarded as structural to the whole project. Gérard Duménil and Dominique Lévy, after careful reconstruction of the data, have concluded that neoliberalization was from the very beginning a project to achieve the restoration of class power. After the implementation of neoliberal policies in the late 1970s, the share of national income of the top 1% of income earners in the US soared to reach 15%, very close to its pre-Second World War share by the end of the century. The top 0.1% of income earners in the US increased their share of the national income from 2% in 1978 to over 6% by 1999, while the ratio of the median compensation of workers to the salaries of CEOs increased from just over 30 to 1 in 1970 to nearly 500 to 1 by 2000. Almost certainly, with the Bush administration's tax reforms now taking effect, the concentration of income and wealth in the upper echelons of society is continuing apace, because the estate tax, a tax on wealth, is being phased out, and taxation on income from investments and capital gains is being diminished, while taxation on wages and salaries is maintained. The US is not alone in this. The top 1% of income earners in Britain have doubled their share of the national income from 6.5% to 13% since 1982. And when we look further afield, we see extraordinary concentrations of wealth and power emerging all over the place. A small and powerful oligarchy arose in Russia after neoliberal shock therapy had been administered there in the 1990s. Extraordinary surges in income inequalities and wealth have occurred in China as it has adopted free market-oriented practices. The wave of privatization in Mexico after 1992 catapulted a few individuals, such as Carlos Slim, almost overnight into Fortune's list of the world's wealthiest people. Globally, the countries of Eastern Europe and the CIS have registered some of the largest increases ever in social inequality. OECD countries also registered big increases in inequality after the 1980s, while the income gap between the fifth of the world's people living in the richest countries and the fifth in the poorest was 74-1 in 1997, up from 60-1 in 1990 and 30-1 in 1960. While there are exceptions to this trend, several East and Southeast Asian countries have so far contained income inequalities within reasonable bounds, as has France. The evidence strongly suggests that the neoliberal turn is in some way and to some degree associated with the restoration or reconstruction of the power of economic elites. We can therefore interpret neoliberalization either as a utopian project to realize a theoretical design for the reorganization of international capitalism, or as a political project to re-establish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. In what follows, I shall argue that the second of these objectives has in practice dominated. Neoliberalization has not been very effective in revitalizing global capital accumulation, but it has succeeded remarkably well in restoring, or in some instances, as in Russia and China, creating, the power of an economic elite. The theoretical utopianism of neoliberal argument has, I conclude, primarily worked as a system of justification and legitimation for whatever needed to be done to achieve this goal. The evidence suggests, moreover, that when neoliberal principles clash with the need to restore or sustain elite power, then the principles are either abandoned or become so twisted as to be unrecognizable. This in no way denies the power of ideas to act as a force for historical geographical change, but it does point to a creative tension between the power of neoliberal ideas and the actual practices of neoliberalization that have transformed how global capitalism has been working over the last 3 decades. The rise of neoliberal theory. Neoliberalism, as a potential antidote to threats to the capitalist social order and as a solution to capitalism's ills, had long been lurking in the wings of public policy. A small and exclusive group of passionate advocates, mainly academic economists, historians and philosophers, had gathered together around the renowned Austrian political philosopher Friedrich von Hayek to create the Mont Pelerin Society, named after the Swiss spa where they first met in 1947. The notables included Ludwig von Mises, the economist Milton Friedman, and even, for a time, the noted philosopher Karl Popper. The founding statement of the society read as follows: "The central values of civilization are in danger. Over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared. In others, they are under constant menace from the development of current tendencies of policy. The position of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. Even that most precious possession of Western man, freedom of thought and expression, is threatened by the spread of creeds which, claiming the privilege of tolerance when in the position of a minority, seek only to establish a position of power in which they can suppress and obliterate all views but their own. The group holds that these developments have been fostered by the growth of a view of history which denies all absolute moral standards and by the growth of theories which question the desirability of the rule of law. It holds further that they have been fostered by a decline of belief in private property and the competitive market, for without the diffused power and initiative associated with these institutions, it is difficult to imagine a society in which freedom may be effectively preserved. The group's members depicted themselves as liberals in the traditional European sense because of their fundamental commitment to ideals of personal freedom. The neoliberal label signaled their adherence to those free market principles of neoclassical economics that had emerged in the second half of the 19th century, thanks to the work of Alfred Marshall, William Stanley Jevons, and Léon Walras, to displace the classical theories of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and, of course, Karl Marx. Yet they also held to Adam Smith's view that the hidden hand of the market was the best device for mobilizing even the basest of human instincts, such as gluttony, greed, and the desire for wealth and power for the benefit of all. Neoliberal doctrine was therefore deeply opposed to state interventionist theories, such as those of John Maynard Keynes, which rose to prominence in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. Many policymakers after the Second World War looked to Keynesian theory to guide them as they sought to keep the business cycle and recessions under control. The neoliberals were even more fiercely opposed to theories of centralized state planning, such as those advanced by Oskar Lange, working close to the Marxist tradition. State decisions, they argued, were bound to be politically biased depending upon the strength of the interest groups involved, such as unions, environmentalists, or trade lobbies. State decisions on matters of investment and capital accumulation were bound to be wrong, because the information available to the state could not rival that contained in market signals. This theoretical framework is not, as several commentators have pointed out, entirely coherent. The scientific rigor of its neoclassical economics does not sit easily with its political commitment to ideals of individual freedom, nor does its supposed distrust of all state power fit with the need for a strong and, if necessary, coercive state that will defend the rights of private property, individual liberties, and entrepreneurial freedoms. The juridical trick of defining corporations as individuals before the law introduces its own biases, rendering ironic John D. Rockefeller's personal credo etched in stone in the Rockefeller Center in New York City, where he places the supreme worth of the individual above all else. And there are, as we shall see, enough contradictions in the neoliberal position to render evolving neoliberal practices vis-à-vis issues such as monopoly power and market failures unrecognizable in relation to the seeming purity of neoliberal doctrine. We have to pay careful attention, therefore, to the tension between the theory of neoliberalism and the actual pragmatics of neoliberalization. Hayek, author of key texts such as The Constitution of Liberty, presciently argued that the battle for ideas was key, and that it would probably take at least a generation for that battle to be won, not only against Marxism, but against socialism, state planning, and Keynesian interventionism. The Mont Pelerin group garnered financial and political support. In the US in particular, a powerful group of wealthy individuals and corporate leaders who were viscerally opposed to all forms of state intervention and regulation, and even to internationalism, sought to organize opposition to what they saw as an emerging consensus for pursuing a mixed economy. Fearful of how the alliance with the Soviet Union and the command economy constructed within the US during the Second World War might play out politically in a post-war setting, they were ready to embrace anything from McCarthyism to neoliberal think tanks to protect and enhance their power. Yet this movement remained on the margins of both policy and academic influence until the troubled years of the 1970s. At that point it began to move center stage, particularly in the US and Britain, nurtured in various well-financed think tanks, offshoots of the Mont Pelerin Society such as the Institute of Economic Affairs in London and the Heritage Foundation in Washington, as well as through its growing influence within the academy, particularly at the University of Chicago, where Milton Friedman dominated. Neoliberal theory gained in academic respectability by the award of the Nobel Prize in Economics to Hayek in 1974 and Friedman in 1976. This particular prize, though it assumed the aura of Nobel, had nothing to do with the other prizes and was under the tight control of Sweden's banking elite. Neoliberal theory, particularly in its monetarist guise, began to exert practical influence in a variety of policy fields. During the Carter presidency, for example, deregulation of the economy emerged as one of the answers to the chronic state of stagflation that had prevailed in the US throughout the 1970s. But the dramatic consolidation of neoliberalism as a new economic orthodoxy, regulating public policy at the state level in the advanced capitalist world, occurred in the United States and Britain in 1979. In May of that year, Margaret Thatcher was elected in Britain with a strong mandate to reform the economy. Under the influence of Keith Joseph, a very active and committed publicist and polemicist with strong connections to the Neoliberal Institute of Economic Affairs, she accepted that Keynesianism had to be abandoned, and that monetarist supply-side solutions were essential to cure the stagflation that had characterized the British economy during the 1970s. She recognized that this meant nothing short of a revolution in fiscal and social policies, and immediately signaled a fierce determination to have done with the institutions and political ways of the social democratic state that had been consolidated in Britain after 1945. This entailed confronting trade union power, attacking all forms of social solidarity that hindered competitive flexibility, such as those expressed through municipal governance and including the power of many professionals and their associations, dismantling or rolling back the commitments of the welfare state, the privatization of public enterprises, including social housing, reducing taxes, encouraging entrepreneurial initiative, and creating a favorable business climate to induce a strong inflow of foreign investment, particularly from Japan. There was, she famously declared, no such thing as society, only individual men and women, and, she subsequently added, their families. All forms of social solidarity were to be dissolved in favor of individualism, private property, personal responsibility, and family values. The ideological assault along these lines that flowed from Thatcher's rhetoric was relentless. "Economics are the method," she said, "but the object is to change the soul." And change it she did, though in ways that were by no means comprehensive and complete, let alone free of political costs. In October 1979, Paul Volcker, chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank under President Carter, engineered a draconian shift in U.S. monetary policy. The long-standing commitment in the U.S. liberal democratic state to the principles of the New Deal, which meant broadly Keynesian fiscal and monetary policies with full employment as the key objective, was abandoned in favor of a policy designed to quell inflation no matter what the consequences might be for employment. The real rate of interest, which had often been negative during the double-digit inflationary surge of the 1970s, was rendered positive by fiat of the Federal Reserve. The nominal rate of interest was raised overnight, and after a few ups and downs, by July 1981, stood close to 20%. Thus began a long, deep recession that would empty factories and break unions in the U.S. and drive debtor countries to the brink of insolvency, beginning the long era of structural adjustment. This, Volcker argued, was the only way out of the grumbling crisis of stagflation that had characterized the U.S. and much of the global economy throughout the 1970s. The Volcker shock, as it has since come to be known, has to be interpreted as a necessary but not sufficient condition for neoliberalization. Some central banks had long emphasized anti-inflationary fiscal responsibility and adopted policies that were closer to monetarism than to Keynesian orthodoxy. In the West German case, this derived from historical memories of the runaway inflation that had destroyed the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, setting the stage for the rise of fascism, and the equally dangerous inflation that occurred at the end of the Second World War. The IMF had long set itself against excessive debt creation and urged, if not mandated, fiscal restraints and budgetary austerity on client states. But in all these cases, this monetarism was paralleled by acceptance of strong union power and a political commitment to build a strong welfare state. The turn to neoliberalism thus depended not only on adopting monetarism, but on the unfolding of government policies in many other arenas. Ronald Reagan's victory over Carter in 1980 proved crucial, even though Carter had shifted uneasily towards deregulation of airlines and trucking as a partial solution to the crisis of stagflation. Reagan's advisers were convinced that Volcker's monetarist medicine for a sick and stagnant economy was right on target. Volcker was supported in and reappointed to his position as chair of the Federal Reserve. The Reagan administration then provided the requisite political backing through further deregulation, tax cuts, budget cuts, and attacks on trade union and professional power. Reagan faced down PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, in a lengthy and bitter strike in 1981. This signaled an all-out assault on the powers of organized labor at the very moment when the Volcker-inspired recession was generating high levels of unemployment, 10% or more. But PATCO was more than an ordinary union. It was a white-collar union which had the character of a skilled professional association. It was, therefore, an icon of middle-class rather than working-class unionism. The effect on the condition of labor across the board was dramatic, perhaps best captured by the fact that the federal minimum wage, which stood on a par with the poverty level in 1980, had fallen to 30% below that level by 1990. The long decline in real wage levels then began in earnest. Reagan's appointments to positions of power on issues such as environmental regulation, occupational safety and health took the campaign against big government to even higher levels. The deregulation of everything from airlines and telecommunications to finance opened up new zones of untrammeled market freedoms for powerful corporate interests. Tax breaks on investment effectively subsidized the movement of capital away from the unionized Northeast and Midwest and into the non-union and weakly regulated South and West. Finance capital increasingly looked abroad for higher rates of return. Deindustrialization at home and moves to take production abroad became much more common. The market, depicted ideologically as the way to foster competition and innovation, became a vehicle for the consolidation of monopoly power. Corporate taxes were reduced dramatically, and the top personal tax rate was reduced from 70 to 28% in what was billed as the largest tax cut in history. And so began the momentous shift towards greater social inequality and the restoration of economic power to the upper class. There was, however, one other concomitant shift that also impelled the movement towards neoliberalization during the 1970s. The OPEC oil price hike that came with the oil embargo of 1973 placed vast amounts of financial power at the disposal of the oil-producing states, such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi. We now know from British intelligence reports that the US was actively preparing to invade these countries in 1973 in order to restore the flow of oil and bring down oil prices. We also know that the Saudis agreed at that time, presumably under military pressure if not open threat from the US, to recycle all of their petrodollars through the New York investment banks. The latter suddenly found themselves in command of massive funds for which they needed to find profitable outlets. The options within the US, given the depressed economic conditions and low rates of return in the mid-1970s, were not good. More profitable opportunities had to be sought out abroad. Government seemed the safest bet, because, as Walter Wriston, head of Citibank, famously put it, governments can't move or disappear. And many governments in the developing world, hitherto starved of funds, were anxious enough to borrow. For this to occur required, however, open entry and reasonably secure conditions for lending. The New York investment banks looked to the U.S. imperial tradition, both to prize open new investment opportunities and to protect their foreign operations. The U.S. imperial tradition had been long in the making, and to great degree defined itself against the imperial traditions of Britain, France, Holland, and other European powers. While the US had toyed with colonial conquest at the end of the 19th century, it evolved a more open system of imperialism without colonies during the 20th century. The paradigm case was worked out in Nicaragua in the 1920s and 1930s, when US Marines were deployed to protect US interests, but found themselves embroiled in a lengthy and difficult guerrilla insurgency led by Sandino. The answer was to find a local strongman, in this case Somoza, and to provide economic and military assistance to him and his family and immediate allies so that they could repress or buy off opposition and accumulate considerable wealth and power for themselves. In return, they would always keep their country open to the operations of U.S. capital and support, and if necessary promote U.S. interests, both in the country and in the region, in the Nicaraguan case Central America, as a whole. This was the model that was deployed after the Second World War during the phase of global decolonization imposed upon the European powers at U.S. insistence. For example, the CIA engineered the coup that overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah of Iran, who gave the oil contracts to US companies, and did not return the assets to the British companies that Mossadegh had nationalized. The Shah also became one of the key guardians of US interests in the Middle Eastern oil region. In the post-war period, much of the non-communist world was opened up to US domination by tactics of this sort. This became the method of choice to fight off the threat of communist insurgencies and revolution, entailing an anti-democratic and even more emphatically anti-populist and anti-socialist/communist strategy on the part of the US that put the US more and more in alliance with repressive military dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, most spectacularly, of course, throughout Latin America. The stories told in John Perkins's Confessions of an Economic Hitman are full of the ugly and unsavory details of how this was all too often done. US interests consequently became more rather than less vulnerable in the struggle against international communism. While the consent of local ruling elites could be purchased easily enough, the need to coerce oppositional or social democratic movements, such as Allende's in Chile, associated the US with a long history of largely covert violence against popular movements throughout much of the developing world. It was in this context that the surplus funds being recycled through the New York investment banks were dispersed throughout the world. Before 1973, most U.S. foreign investment was of the direct sort, mainly concerned with the exploitation of raw material resources, oil, minerals, raw materials, agricultural products, or the cultivation of specific markets, telecommunications, automobiles, etc., in Europe and Latin America. The New York investment banks had always been active internationally, but after 1973 they became even more so, though now far more focused on lending capital to foreign governments. This required the liberalization of international credit and financial markets, and the US government began actively to promote and support this strategy globally during the 1970s. Hungry for credit, developing countries were encouraged to borrow heavily, though at rates that were advantageous to the New York bankers. Since the loans were designated in US dollars, however, any modest, let alone precipitous rise in US interest rates could easily push vulnerable countries into default. The New York investment banks would then be exposed to serious losses. The first major test case of this came in the wake of the Volcker shock that drove Mexico into default in 1982-4. The Reagan administration, which had seriously thought of withdrawing support for the IMF in its first year in office, found a way to put together the powers of the US Treasury and the IMF to resolve the difficulty by rolling over the debt, but did so in return for neoliberal reforms. This treatment became standard after what Stiglitz refers to as a purge of all Keynesian influences from the IMF in 1982. The IMF and the World Bank thereafter became centers for the propagation and enforcement of free market fundamentalism and neoliberal orthodoxy. In return for debt rescheduling, indebted countries were required to implement institutional reforms, such as cuts in welfare expenditures, more flexible labor market laws, and privatization. Thus was structural adjustment invented. Mexico was one of the first states drawn into what was to become a growing column of neoliberal state apparatuses worldwide. What the Mexico case demonstrated, however, was a key difference between liberal and neoliberal practice. Under the former, lenders take the losses that arise from bad investment decisions, while under the latter, the borrowers are forced by state and international powers to take on board the cost of debt repayment, no matter what the consequences for the livelihood and well-being of the local population. If this required the surrender of assets to foreign companies at fire sale prices, then so be it. This, it turns out, is not consistent with neoliberal theory. One effect, as Duménil and Lévy show, was to permit US owners of capital to extract high rates of return from the rest of the world during the 1980s and 1990s. The restoration of power to an economic elite or upper class in the US and elsewhere in the advanced capitalist countries drew heavily on surpluses extracted from the rest of the world through international flows and structural adjustment practices. The meaning of class power. But what exactly is meant here by class? This is always a somewhat shadowy, some would even say dubious concept. Neoliberalization has in any case entailed its redefinition. This poses a problem. If neoliberalization has been a vehicle for the restoration of class power, then we should be able to identify the class forces behind it and those that have benefited from it. But this is difficult to do when class is not a stable social configuration. In some cases, traditional strata have managed to hang on to a consistent power base, often organized through family and kinship. But in other instances, neoliberalization has been accompanied by a reconfiguration of what constitutes an upper class. Margaret Thatcher, for example, attacked some of the entrenched forms of class power in Britain. She went against the aristocratic tradition that dominated in the military, the judiciary, and the financial elite in the City of London and many segments of industry, and sided with the brash entrepreneurs and the nouveau riche. She supported, and was usually supported by, this new class of entrepreneurs, such as Richard Branson, Lord Hanson, and George Soros. The traditional wing of her own Conservative Party was appalled. In the US, the rising power and significance of the financiers and the CEOs of large corporations, as well as the immense burst of activity in wholly new sectors, such as computing and the internet, media and retailing, changed the locus of upper-class economic power significantly. While neoliberalization may have been about the restoration of class power, it has not necessarily meant the restoration of economic power to the same people. But as the contrasting cases of the US and Britain illustrate, class means different things in different places, and in some instances, for example in the US, it is often held to have no meaning at all. In addition, there have been strong currents of differentiation in terms of class identity formation and reformation in different parts of the world. In Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines, for example, economic power became strongly concentrated among a few ethnic minority Chinese, and the mode of acquisition of that economic power was quite different from that in Australia or the US. It was heavily concentrated in trading activities and entailed the cornering of markets. And the rise of the 7 oligarchs in Russia derived from the quite unique configuration of circumstances that held in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, there are some general trends that can be identified. The first is for the privileges of ownership and management of capitalist enterprises, traditionally separated, to fuse by paying CEOs, managers, in stock options, ownership titles. Stock values rather than production then became the guiding light of economic activity, and as later became apparent with the collapse of companies such as Enron, the speculative temptations that resulted from this could become overwhelming. The second trend has been to dramatically reduce the historical gap between money capital earning dividends and interest on the one hand, and production, manufacturing or merchant capital looking to gain profits on the other. This separation had at various times in the past produced conflicts between financiers, producers and merchants. In Britain, for example, government policy in the 1960s catered primarily to the requirements of the financiers in the City of London, often to the detriment of domestic manufacturing. And in the 1960s, conflicts in the US between financiers and manufacturing corporations had often surfaced. During the 1970s, much of this conflict either disappeared or took new forms. The large corporations became more and more financial in their orientation, even when, as in the automobile sector, they were engaging in production. Since 1980 or so, it has not been uncommon for corporations to report losses in production offset by gains from financial operations, everything from credit and insurance operations to speculating in volatile currency and futures markets. Mergers across sectors, conjoined production, merchanting, real estate and financial interests in new ways to produce diversified conglomerates. When US Steel changed its name to USX, purchasing strong stakes in insurance, the chairman of the board, James Roderick, replied to the question, "What is X?" with the simple answer, "X stands for money." All of this connected to the strong burst in activity and power within the world of finance. Increasingly freed from the regulatory constraints and barriers that had hitherto confined its field of action, financial activity could flourish as never before, eventually everywhere. A wave of innovations occurred in financial services to produce not only far more sophisticated global interconnections, but also new kinds of financial markets based on securitization, derivatives, and all manner of futures trading. Neoliberalization has meant, in short, the financialization of everything. This deepened the hold of finance over all other areas of the economy, as well as over the state apparatus, and, as Randy Martin points out, daily life. It also introduced an accelerating volatility into global exchange relations. There was unquestionably a power shift away from production to the world of finance. Gains in manufacturing capacity no longer necessarily meant rising per capita incomes, but concentration on financial services certainly did. For this reason, the support of financial institutions and the integrity of the financial system became the central concern of the collectivity of neoliberal states, such as the group comprising the world's richest countries, known as the G7. In the event of a conflict between Main Street and Wall Street, the latter was to be favored. The real possibility then arises that while Wall Street does well, the rest of the US, as well as the rest of the world, does badly. And for several years, particularly during the 1990s, this is exactly what happened. While the slogan was often advanced in the 1960s that what was good for General Motors was good for the US, this had changed by the 1990s into the slogan that what is good for Wall Street is all that matters. One substantial core of rising class power under neoliberalism lies therefore with the CEOs, the key operators on corporate boards, and the leaders in the financial, legal, and technical apparatuses that surround this inner sanctum of capitalist activity. The power of the actual owners of capital, the stockholders, has however been somewhat diminished, unless they can gain a sufficiently large voting interest to affect corporate policy. Shareholders have on occasion been bilked of millions by the operations of the CEOs and their financial advisors. Speculative gains have also made it possible to amass enormous fortunes within a very short period of time. Examples are Warren Buffett and George Soros. But it would be wrong to confine the notion of the upper class to this group alone. The opening up of entrepreneurial opportunities, as well as new structures in trading relations, have allowed substantially new processes of class formation to emerge. Vast fortunes were made in new sectors of the economy, such as biotechnology and information technologies, for example by Bill Gates and Paul Allen. New market relations opened up all manner of possibilities to buy cheap and sell dear, if not to actually corner markets in such a way as to build fortunes that can either extend horizontally, as in the case of Rupert Murdoch's sprawling global media empire, or be diversified into all manner of businesses, extending backwards into resource extraction and production, and forwards from a trading base into financial services, real estate development, and retailing. In this, it frequently happened that a privileged relationship to state power also played a key role. The two businessmen who were closest to Suharto in Indonesia, for example, both fed the Suharto family financial interests, but also fed off their connections to that state apparatus to become immensely rich. By 1997, one of them, the Salim Group, was reportedly the world's largest Chinese-owned conglomerate, with $20 billion in assets and some 500 companies. Starting with a relatively small investment company, Carlos Slim gained control over the newly privatized telecommunications system in Mexico and quickly parlayed that into a huge conglomerate empire that controls not only a huge slice of the Mexican economy, but has sprawling interests in U.S. retailing, Circuit City and Barnes & Noble, as well as throughout Latin America. In the U.S., the Walton family has become immensely rich as Walmart has surged into a dominant position in U.S. retailing, but with integration into Chinese production lines as well as retail stores worldwide. While there are obvious links between these sorts of activities and the world of finance, the incredible ability not only to amass large personal fortunes, but to exercise a controlling power over large segments of the economy confers on these few individuals immense economic power to influence political processes. Small wonder that the net worth of the 358 richest people in 1996 was equal to the combined income of the poorest 45% of the world's population, 2.3 billion people. Worse still, the world's 200 richest people more than doubled their net worth in the 4 years to 1998 to more than $1 trillion. The assets of the top 3 billionaires were by then more than the combined GNP of all least developed countries and their 600 million people. There is, however, one further conundrum to be considered in this process of radical reconfiguration of class relations. The question arises, and has been much debated, as to whether this new class configuration should be considered as transnational, or whether it can still be understood as something based exclusively within the parameters of the nation-state. My own position is this. The case that the ruling class anywhere has ever confined its operations and defined its loyalties to any one nation-state has historically been much overstated. It never did make much sense to speak of a distinctively U.S. versus British or French or German or Korean capitalist class. The international links were always important, particularly through colonial and neo-colonial activities, but also through transnational connections that go back to the 19th century, if not before. But there has undoubtedly been a deepening as well as a widening of these transnational connections during the phase of neoliberal globalization, and it is vital that these connectivities be acknowledged. This does not mean, however, that the leading individuals within this class do not attach themselves to specific state apparatuses for both the advantages and the protections that this affords them. Where they specifically attach themselves is important, but is no more stable than the capitalist activity they pursue. Rupert Murdoch may begin in Australia, then concentrate on Britain, before finally taking up citizenship, doubtless on an accelerated schedule, in the US. He is not above or outside particular state powers, but by the same token, he wields considerable influence via his media interests in politics in Britain, the US, and Australia. All 247 of the supposedly independent editors of his newspapers worldwide supported the US invasion of Iraq. As a form of shorthand, however, it still makes sense to speak about US or British or Korean capitalist class interests, because corporate interests like Murdoch's, or those of Carlos Slim or the Salim Group, both feed off and nurture specific state apparatuses. Each can, and typically does, however, exert class power in more than one state simultaneously. While this disparate group of individuals embedded in the corporate, financial, trading and developer worlds do not necessarily conspire as a class, and while there may be frequent tensions between them, they nevertheless possess a certain accordance of interests that generally recognizes the advantages, and now some of the dangers, to be derived from neoliberalization. They also possess, through organizations like the World Economic Forum at Davos, means of exchanging ideas and of consorting and consulting with political leaders. They exercise immense influence over global affairs, and possess a freedom of action that no ordinary citizen possesses. Freedom's prospect. This history of neoliberalization and class formation, and the proliferating acceptance of the ideas of the Mont Pelerin Society as the ruling ideas of the time, makes for interesting reading when placed against the background of counter-arguments laid out by Karl Polanyi in 1944, shortly before the Mont Pelerin Society was established. In a complex society, he pointed out, the meaning of freedom becomes as contradictory and as fraught as its incitements to action are compelling. There are, he noted, two kinds of freedom, one good and the other bad. Among the latter he listed the freedom to exploit one's fellows, or the freedom to make inordinate gains without commensurable service to the community, the freedom to keep technological inventions from being used for public benefit, or the freedom to profit from public calamities secretly engineered for private advantage. But, Polanyi continued, the market economy under which these freedoms throve also produced freedoms we prize highly: freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of meeting, freedom of association, freedom to choose one's own job. While we may cherish these freedoms for their own sake, and surely many of us still do, they were to a large extent byproducts of the same economy that was also responsible for the evil freedoms. Polanyi's answer to this duality makes strange reading given the current hegemony of neoliberal thinking. The passing of the market economy can become the beginning of an era of unprecedented freedom. Juridical and actual freedom can be made wider and more general than ever before. Regulation and control can achieve freedom not only for the few, but for all. Freedom not as an appurtenance of privilege, tainted at the source, but as a prescriptive right extending far beyond the narrow confines of the political sphere into the intimate organization of society itself. Thus will old freedoms and civic rights be added to the fund of new freedoms generated by the leisure and security that industrial society offers to all. Such a society can afford to be both just and free. Unfortunately, Polanyi noted, the passage to such a future is blocked by the moral obstacle of liberal utopianism, and more than once he cites Hayek as an exemplar of that tradition. Planning and control are being attacked as a denial of freedom. Free enterprise and private ownership are declared to be essentials of freedom. No society built on other foundations is said to deserve to be called free. The freedom that regulation creates is denounced as unfreedom. The justice, liberty, and welfare it offers are decried as a camouflage of slavery. The idea of freedom thus degenerates into a mere advocacy of free enterprise, which means the fullness of freedom for those whose income, leisure, and security need no enhancing, and a mere pittance of liberty for the people, who may in vain attempt to make use of their democratic rights to gain shelter from the power of the owners of property. But if, as is always the case, no society is possible in which power and compulsion are absent, nor a world in which force has no function, then the only way this liberal utopian vision could be sustained is by force, violence, and authoritarianism. Liberal or neoliberal utopianism is doomed, in Polanyi's view, to be frustrated by authoritarianism or even outright fascism. The good freedoms are lost, the bad ones take over. Polanyi's diagnosis appears peculiarly appropriate to our contemporary condition. It provides a powerful vantage point from which to understand what President Bush intends when he asserts that, as the greatest power on earth, we, the US, have an obligation to help the spread of freedom. It helps explain why neoliberalism has turned so authoritarian, forceful, and anti-democratic at the very moment when humanity holds in its hands the opportunity to offer freedom's triumph over all its age-old foes. It makes us focus on how so many corporations have profiteered from withholding the benefits of their technologies, such as AIDS drugs, from the public sphere, as well as from the calamities of war, as in the case of Halliburton, famine, and environmental disaster. It raises the worry as to whether or not many of these calamities or near-calamities, arms races, and the need to confront both real and imagined enemies have been secretly engineered for corporate advantage. And it makes it all too clear why those of wealth and power so avidly support certain conceptions of rights and freedoms while seeking to persuade us of their universality and goodness. 30 years of neoliberal freedoms have, after all, not only restored power to a narrowly defined capitalist class, they have also produced immense concentrations of corporate power in energy, the media, pharmaceuticals, transportation, and even retailing, for example, Walmart. The freedom of the market that Bush proclaims as the high point of human aspiration turns out to be nothing more than the convenient means to spread corporate monopoly power and Coca-Cola everywhere without constraint. With disproportionate influence over the media and the political process, this class, with Rupert Murdoch and Fox News in the lead, has both the incentive and the power to persuade us that we are all better off under a neoliberal regime of freedoms. For the elite, living comfortably in their gilded ghettos, the world must indeed seem a better place. As Polanyi might have put it, neoliberalism confers rights and freedoms on those whose income, leisure, and security need no enhancing, leaving a pittance for the rest of us. How is it, then, that the rest of us have so easily acquiesced in this state of affairs? 2. The construction of consent. How was neoliberalization accomplished, and by whom? The answer in countries such as Chile and Argentina in the 1970s was as simple as it was swift, brutal, and sure. A military coup, backed by the traditional upper classes, as well as by the US government, followed by the fierce repression of all solidarities created within the labor and urban social movements which had so threatened their power. But the neoliberal revolution, usually attributed to Thatcher and Reagan after 1979, had to be accomplished by democratic means. For a shift of this magnitude to occur required the prior construction of political consent across a sufficiently large spectrum of the population to win elections. What Gramsci calls common sense, defined as the sense held in common, typically grounds consent. Common sense is constructed out of long-standing practices of cultural socialization, often rooted deep in regional or national traditions. It is not the same as the good sense that can be constructed out of critical engagement with the issues of the day. Common sense can therefore be profoundly misleading, obfuscating, or disguising real problems under cultural prejudices. Cultural and traditional values, such as belief in God and country, or views on the position of women in society, and fears of communists, immigrants, strangers, or others, can be mobilized to mask other realities. Political slogans can be invoked that mask specific strategies beneath vague rhetorical devices. The word freedom resonates so widely within the common-sense understanding of Americans that it becomes a button that elites can press to open the door to the masses, to justify almost anything. Thus could Bush retrospectively justify the Iraq War. Gramsci therefore concluded that political questions become insoluble when disguised as cultural ones. In seeking to understand the construction of political consent, we must learn to extract political meanings from their cultural integuments. So how, then, was sufficient popular consent generated to legitimize the neoliberal turn? The channels through which this was done were diverse. Powerful ideological influences circulated through the corporations, the media, and the numerous institutions that constitute civil society, such as the universities, schools, churches, and professional associations. The long march of neoliberal ideas through these institutions that Hayek had envisaged back in 1947, the organization of think tanks with corporate backing and funding, the capture of certain segments of the media, and the conversion of many intellectuals to neoliberal ways of thinking, created a climate of opinion in support of neoliberalism as the exclusive guarantor of freedom. These movements were later consolidated through the capture of political parties and, ultimately, state power. Appeals to traditions and cultural values bulked large in all of this. An open project around the restoration of economic power to a small elite would probably not gain much popular support. But a programmatic attempt to advance the cause of individual freedoms could appeal to a mass base and so disguise the drive to restore class power. Furthermore, once the state apparatus made the neoliberal turn, it could use its powers of persuasion, co-optation, bribery, and threat to maintain the climate of consent necessary to perpetuate its power. This was Thatcher's and Reagan's particular forte, as we shall see. How, then, did neoliberalism negotiate the turn to so comprehensively displace embedded liberalism? In some instances, the answer largely lies in the use of force, either military, as in Chile, or financial, as through the operations of the IMF in Mozambique or the Philippines. Coercion can produce a fatalistic, even abject acceptance of the idea that there was and is, as Margaret Thatcher kept insisting, no alternative. The active construction of consent has also varied from place to place. Furthermore, as numerous oppositional movements attest, consent has often wilted or failed in different places. But we must look beyond these infinitely varied ideological and cultural mechanisms, no matter how important they are, to the qualities of everyday experience, in order to better identify the material grounding for the construction of consent. And it is at that level, through the experience of daily life under capitalism in the 1970s, that we begin to see how neoliberalism penetrated common sense understandings. The effect in many parts of the world has increasingly been to see it as a necessary, even wholly natural way for the social order to be regulated. Any political movement that holds individual freedoms to be sacrosanct is vulnerable to incorporation into the neoliberal fold. The worldwide political upheavals of 1968, for example, were strongly inflected with the desire for greater personal freedoms. This was certainly true for students, such as those animated by the Berkeley free speech movement of the 1960s, or who took to the streets in Paris, Berlin, and Bangkok, and were so mercilessly shot down in Mexico City shortly before the 1968 Olympic Games. They demanded freedom from parental, educational, corporate, bureaucratic, and state constraints. But the '68 movement also had social justice as a primary political objective. Values of individual freedom and social justice are not, however, necessarily compatible. Pursuit of social justice presupposes social solidarities and a willingness to submerge individual wants, needs, and desires in the cause of some more general struggle for, say, social equality or environmental justice. The objectives of social justice and individual freedom were uneasily fused in the movement of '68. The tension was most evident in the fraught relationship between the traditional left, organized labor and political parties espousing social solidarities, and the student movement desirous of individual liberties. The suspicion and hostility that separated these two fractions in France, e.g. the Communist Party and the student movement, during the events of 1968, is a case in point. While it is not impossible to bridge such differences, it is not hard to see how a wedge might be driven between them. Neoliberal rhetoric, with its foundational emphasis upon individual freedoms, has the power to split off libertarianism, identity politics, multiculturalism, and eventually narcissistic consumerism from the social forces ranged in pursuit of social justice through the conquest of state power. It has long proved extremely difficult within the US left, for example, to forge the collective discipline required for political action to achieve social justice without offending the desire of political actors for individual freedom and for full recognition and expression of particular identities. Neoliberalism did not create these distinctions, but it could easily exploit, if not foment them. In the early 1970s, those seeking individual freedoms and social justice could make common cause in the face of what many saw as a common enemy. Powerful corporations, in alliance with an interventionist state, were seen to be running the world in individually oppressive and socially unjust ways. The Vietnam War was the most obvious catalyst for discontent, but the destructive activities of corporations and the state in relation to the environment, the push towards mindless consumerism, the failure to address social issues and respond adequately to diversity, as well as intense restrictions on individual possibilities and personal behaviors by state-mandated and traditional controls, were also widely resented. Civil rights were an issue, and questions of sexuality and of reproductive rights were very much in play. For almost everyone involved in the movement of '68, the intrusive state was the enemy, and it had to be reformed. And on that, the neoliberals could easily agree. But capitalist corporations, business, and the market system were also seen as primary enemies, requiring redress, if not revolutionary transformation. Hence the threat to capitalist class power. By capturing ideals of individual freedom and turning them against the interventionist and regulatory practices of the state, capitalist class interests could hope to protect and even restore their position. Neoliberalism was well suited to this ideological task, but it had to be backed up by a practical strategy that emphasized the liberty of consumer choice, not only with respect to particular products, but also with respect to lifestyles, modes of expression, and a wide range of cultural practices. Neoliberalization required both politically and economically the construction of a neoliberal, market-based, populist culture of differentiated consumerism and individual libertarianism. As such, it proved more than a little compatible with that cultural impulse called postmodernism, which had long been lurking in the wings, but could now emerge full-blown as both a cultural and an intellectual dominant. This was the challenge that corporations and class elites set out to finesse in the 1980s. None of this was very clear at the time. Left movements failed to recognize or confront, let alone transcend, the inherent tension between the quest for individual freedoms and social justice. But the intuitive sense of the problem was, I suspect, clear enough to many in the upper class, even to those who had never read Hayek or even heard of neoliberal theory. Let me illustrate this idea by comparing the neoliberal turns in the US and Britain in the troubled years of the 1970s. In the US case, I begin with a confidential memo sent by Lewis Powell to the US Chamber of Commerce in August 1971. Powell, about to be elevated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, argued that criticism of and opposition to the U.S. free enterprise system had gone too far, and that the time had come, indeed it is long overdue, for the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American business to be marshaled against those who would destroy it. Powell argued that individual action was insufficient. Strength, he wrote, lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. The National Chamber of Commerce, he argued, should lead an assault upon the major institutions, universities, schools, the media, publishing, the courts, in order to change how individuals think about the corporation, the law, culture, and the individual. U.S. businesses did not lack resources for such an effort, particularly when pooled. How directly influential this appeal to engage in class war was is hard to tell. But we do know that the American Chamber of Commerce subsequently expanded its base from around 60,000 firms in 1972 to over 250,000 10 years later. Jointly with the National Association of Manufacturers, which moved to Washington in 1972, it amassed an immense campaign chest to lobby Congress and engage in research. The Business Roundtable, an organization of CEOs committed to the aggressive pursuit of political power for the corporation, was founded in 1972 and thereafter became the centerpiece of collective pro-business action. The corporations involved accounted for about 1/2 of the GNP of the United States during the 1970s, and they spent close to $900 million annually, a huge amount at that time, on political matters. Think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, the Center for the Study of American Business, and the American Enterprise Institute were formed with corporate backing, both to polemicize and, when necessary, as in the case of the National Bureau of Economic Research, to construct serious technical and empirical studies and political philosophical arguments broadly in support of neoliberal policies. Nearly half the financing for the highly respected NBER came from the leading companies in the Fortune 500 list. Closely integrated with the academic community, the NBER was to have a very significant impact on thinking in the economics departments and business schools of the major research universities. With abundant finance furnished by wealthy individuals, such as the brewer Joseph Coors, who later became a member of Reagan's kitchen cabinet, and their foundations, for example, Olin, Scaife, Smith Richardson, Pew Charitable Trust, a flood of tracts and books, with Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, perhaps the most widely read and appreciated, emerged espousing neoliberal values. A TV version of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose was funded with a grant from SCAFE in 1977. Business was, Blythe concludes, learning to spend as a class. In singling out the universities for particular attention, Powell pointed up an opportunity as well as an issue, for these were indeed centers of anti-corporate and anti-state sentiment. The students at Santa Barbara had burned down the Bank of America building there and ceremonially buried a car in the sands. But many students were and still are affluent and privileged, or at least middle class, and in the US the values of individual freedom have long been celebrated in music and popular culture as primary. Neoliberal themes could here find fertile ground for propagation. Powell did not argue for extending state power, but business should assiduously cultivate the state and, when necessary, use it aggressively and with determination. But exactly how was state power to be deployed to reshape common-sense understandings? One line of response to the double crisis of capital accumulation and class power arose in the trenches of the urban struggles of the 1970s. The New York City fiscal crisis was an iconic case. Capitalist restructuring and deindustrialization had for several years been eroding the economic base of the city, and rapid suburbanization had left much of the central city impoverished. The result was explosive social unrest on the part of marginalized populations during the 1960s, defining what came to be known as the urban crisis. Similar problems emerged in many U.S. cities. The expansion of public employment and public provision, facilitated in part by generous federal funding, was seen as the solution. But faced with fiscal difficulties, President Nixon simply declared the urban crisis over in the early 1970s. While this was news to many city dwellers, it signaled diminished federal aid. As the recession gathered pace, the gap between revenues and outlays in the New York City budget, already large because of profligate borrowing over many years, increased. At first, financial institutions were prepared to bridge the gap, but in 1975, a powerful cabal of investment bankers, led by Walter Wriston of Citibank, refused to roll over the debt and pushed the city into technical bankruptcy. The bailout that followed entailed the construction of new institutions that took over the management of the city budget. They had first claim on city tax revenues in order to first pay off bondholders. Whatever was left went for essential services. The effect was to curb the aspirations of the city's powerful municipal unions, to implement wage freezes and cutbacks in public employment and social provision, education, public health, transport services, and to impose user fees. Tuition was introduced into the CUNY University system for the first time. The final indignity was the requirement that municipal unions should invest their pension funds in city bonds. Unions then either moderated their demands or faced the prospect of losing their pension funds through city bankruptcy. This amounted to a coup by the financial institutions against the democratically elected government of New York City, and it was every bit as effective as the military coup that had earlier occurred in Chile. Wealth was redistributed to the upper classes in the midst of a fiscal crisis. The New York crisis was, Zevin argues, symptomatic of an emerging strategy of disinflation coupled with a regressive redistribution of income, wealth, and power. It was an early, perhaps decisive battle in a new war, the purpose of which was to show others that what is happening to New York could and in some cases will happen to them. Whether everyone involved in negotiating this fiscal compromise understood it as a strategy to restore class power is an open question. The need to maintain fiscal discipline is a matter of concern in its own right, and does not, like monetarism more generally, necessarily entail regressive redistributions. It is unlikely, for example, that Felix Rohatyn, the merchant banker who brokered the deal between the city, the state, and the financial institutions, had the restoration of class power in mind. The only way he could save the city was by satisfying the investment bankers while diminishing the standard of living of most New Yorkers. But the restoration of class power was almost certainly what investment bankers like Walter Wriston had in mind. He had, after all, equated all forms of government intervention in the US and Britain with communism. And it was almost certainly the aim of Ford's Secretary of the Treasury, William Simon, later to become head of the ultra-conservative Olin Foundation. Watching the progress of events in Chile with approval, he strongly advised President Ford to refuse aid to the city. "Ford to city, drop dead," ran the headline in the New York Daily News. The terms of any bailout, he said, should be so punitive, the overall experience so painful, that no city, no political subdivision would ever be tempted to go down the same road. While resistance to the austerity measures was widespread, it could only, according to Freeman, slow the counter-revolution from above. It could not stop it. Within a few years, many of the historic achievements of working-class New York were undone. Much of the social infrastructure of the city was diminished, and the physical infrastructure, for example the subway system, deteriorated markedly for lack of investment or even maintenance. Daily life in New York became grueling, and the civic atmosphere turned mean. The city government, the municipal labor movement, and working-class New Yorkers were effectively stripped of much of the power they had accumulated over the previous 3 decades. Demoralized, working-class New Yorkers reluctantly assented to the new realities. But the New York investment bankers did not walk away from the city. They seized the opportunity to restructure it in ways that suited their agenda. The creation of a good business climate was a priority. This meant using public resources to build appropriate infrastructures for business, particularly in telecommunications, coupled with subsidies and tax incentives for capitalist enterprises. Corporate welfare substituted for people welfare. The city's elite institutions were mobilized to sell the image of the city as a cultural center and tourist destination, inventing the famous logo, "I Love New York." The ruling elites moved, often fractiously, to support the opening up of the cultural field to all manner of diverse cosmopolitan currents. The narcissistic exploration of self, sexuality, and identity became the leitmotif of bourgeois urban culture. Artistic freedom and artistic license, promoted by the city's powerful cultural institutions, led in effect to the neoliberalization of culture. Delirious New York, to use Rem Koolhaas's memorable phrase, erased the collective memory of democratic New York. The city's elites acceded, though not without a struggle, to the demand for lifestyle diversification, including those attached to sexual preference and gender, and increasing consumer niche choices in areas such as cultural production. New York became the epicenter of postmodern cultural and intellectual experimentation. Meanwhile, the investment bankers reconstructed the city economy around financial activities, ancillary services such as legal services and the media, much revived by the financialization then occurring, and diversified consumerism, gentrification and neighborhood restoration playing a prominent and profitable role. City government was more and more construed as an entrepreneurial rather than a social democratic or even managerial entity. Interurban competition for investment capital transformed government into urban governance through public-private partnerships. City business was increasingly conducted behind closed doors, and the democratic and representational content of local governance diminished. Working-class and ethnic immigrant New York was thrust back into the shadows, to be ravaged by racism and a crack cocaine epidemic of epic proportions in the 1980s that left many young people either dead, incarcerated, or homeless, only to be bludgeoned again by the AIDS epidemic that carried over into the 1990s. Redistribution through criminal violence became one of the few serious options for the poor, and the authorities responded by criminalizing whole communities of impoverished and marginalized populations. The victims were blamed, and Giuliani was to claim fame by taking revenge on behalf of an increasingly affluent Manhattan bourgeoisie, tired of having to confront the effects of such devastation on their own doorsteps. The management of the New York fiscal crisis pioneered the way for neoliberal practices both domestically under Reagan and internationally through the IMF in the 1980s. It established the principle that in the event of a conflict between the integrity of financial institutions and bondholders' returns on the one hand, and the well-being of the citizens on the other, the former was to be privileged. It emphasized that the role of government was to create a good business climate rather than look to the needs and well-being of the population at large. The politics of the Reagan administration of the 1980s, Tabb concludes, became merely the New York scenario of the 1970s writ large. The translation of these local conclusions of the mid-1970s to the national level was fast-moving. Thomas Edsall, a journalist who covered Washington affairs for many years, published a prescient account in 1985. During the 1970s, business refined its ability to act as a class, submerging competitive instincts in favor of joint cooperative action in the legislative arena. Rather than individual companies seeking only special favors, the dominant theme in the political strategy of business became a shared interest in the defeat of bills such as consumer protection and labor law reform, and in the enactment of favorable tax, regulatory, and antitrust legislation. In order to realize this goal, businesses needed a political class instrument and a popular base. They therefore actively sought to capture the Republican Party as their own instrument. The formation of powerful political action committees to procure, as the old adage had it, the best government that money could buy was an important step. The supposedly progressive campaign finance laws of 1971 in effect legalized the financial corruption of politics. A crucial set of Supreme Court decisions began in 1976 when it was first established that the right of a corporation to make unlimited money contributions to political parties and political action committees was protected under the First Amendment, guaranteeing the rights of individuals, in this instance corporations, to freedom of speech. Political action committees, PACs, could thereafter ensure the financial domination of both political parties by corporate, moneyed, and professional association interests. Corporate PACs, which numbered 89 in 1974, had burgeoned to 1,467 by 1982. While these were willing to fund powerful incumbents of both parties, provided their interests were served, they also systematically leaned towards supporting right-wing challengers. In the late 1970s, Reagan, then governor of California, and William Simon, whom we have already encountered, went out of their way to urge the PACs to direct their efforts towards funding Republican candidates with right-wing sympathies. The $5,000 limit on each PAC's contribution to any one individual forced PACs from different corporations and industries to work together, and that meant building alliances based on class rather than particular interests. The willingness of the Republican Party to become the representative of its dominant class constituency during this period contrasted, Edsall notes, with the ideologically ambivalent attitude of the Democrats, which grew out of the fact that its ties to various groups in society are diffuse, and none of these groups, women, blacks, labor, the elderly, Hispanics, urban political organizations, stands clearly larger than the others. The dependency of Democrats furthermore on big money contributions rendered many of them highly vulnerable to direct influence from business interests. While the Democratic Party had a popular base, it could not easily pursue an anti-capitalist or anti-corporate political line without totally severing its connections with powerful financial interests. The Republican Party needed, however, a solid electoral base if it was to colonize power effectively. It was around this time that Republicans sought an alliance with the Christian right. The latter had not been politically active in the past, but the foundation of Jerry Falwell's moral majority as a political movement in 1978 changed all of that. The Republican Party now had its Christian base. It also appealed to the cultural nationalism of the white working classes and their besieged sense of moral righteousness. Besieged because this class lived under conditions of chronic economic insecurity and felt excluded from many of the benefits that were being distributed through affirmative action and other state programs. This political base could be mobilized through the positives of religion and cultural nationalism, and negatively through coded, if not blatant, racism, homophobia, and anti-feminism. The problem was not capitalism and the neoliberalization of culture, but the liberals, who had used excessive state power to provide for special groups, blacks, women, environmentalists, etc. A well-funded movement of neoconservative intellectuals gathered around Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and the journal Commentary, espousing morality and traditional values, gave credence to these theses. Supporting the neoliberal turn economically but not culturally, they excoriated the interventionist excesses of a so-called liberal elite, thus greatly muddying what the term liberal might mean. The effect was to divert attention from capitalism and corporate power as in any way having anything to do with either the economic or the cultural problems that unbridled commercialism and individualism were creating. From then on, the unholy alliance between big business and conservative Christians, backed by the neoconservatives, steadily consolidated, eventually eradicating all liberal elements, significant and influential in the 1960s, from the Republican Party, particularly after 1990, and turning it into the relatively homogeneous right-wing electoral force of present times. Not for the first, nor it is to be feared for the last time in history, has a social group been persuaded to vote against its material, economic and class interests